Hello, everyone. Today we will be doing an interview with Dr. Robert Koons. Dr. Robert Koons, please tell us something about yourself.
Yes, thanks, Ivan. So I teach at the University of Texas in Austin, teach philosophy, been there 36 years now. And I do mostly contemporary metaphysics, but with an Aristotelian twist to it in general, philosophy of religion as well. Yeah, I guess that's a good introduction.
Yeah, thank you very
Thanks,
much.
thanks so much for inviting me. Appreciate the chance to
Yeah,
chat.
of course. We greatly appreciate you taking your time and coming here to talk with us today. So today we're going to be talking about the Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics as well as causal Finitism. Dr. Koons, would you be willing to give us a like a brief explanation of what Neo-Aristotelian encompasses? What are some main features of Neo-Aristotelian philosophy, just so that our viewers could get a little bit of a introduction?
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot to say. As you know, the Aristotelian framework was really dominant in the Western world for 5-6 centuries there, from around the 11th, 12th century AD to 17th century, roughly. Almost everybody worked with an Aristotelian vocabulary. And then with the scientific revolution and other things, there was a big pushback against Aristotle in the 17th, 18th centuries. But I think what we've been seeing in the last 150 years really is a significant resurgence of interest in Aristotle. You could go back to von Trendelenburg in Germany or Brentano in Austria. And then with the reemergence of metaphysics in the English-speaking world after the collapse of logical positivism in the 20s and 30s, people began turning back to Aristotle, and in many ways, we've seen this in philosophy of science and in metaphysics and in ethics with people like Elizabeth Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre. So it's been across a kind of a wide front, actually, of return to Aristotelian ideas. So let's see, what could we? I mean, I could go through some of the main ideas, I guess. One thing
Yeah.
we've seen a lot in metaphysics is an interest in causal powers and potentialities, which are really perhaps the key idea of Aristotle. Really, is this notion of powers and potentialities. So again, with the positivists, and also really with the early Russell, in the English-speaking world, there was an attempt to eliminate powers and potentialities and even possibility, and just talk about the actual world and describing the actual world in mathematical terms. And then there was a lot of concern about what a law was, and the consensus, so to speak, the sort of neo-Humean consensus was that laws of nature are just true generalizations that we treat as laws in a kind of quasi-conventional way. There's certain generalizations that we like; they fit our scientific practice, so we elevate those to laws. And then starting in the 70s, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with that account. Right, it made laws of nature very anthropocentric. Right, they were not deep facts about nature, but just things we've invented. And so there was a movement by people like Michael Tooley and Fred Dretske and David Armstrong to try to give an ontological basis to laws of nature. Right, laws of nature have a kind of basis in reality, but then that fell apart under criticism by people like Vas van Frossen, which is, if you think that the laws of nature are some kind of metaphysical fact about universals, like connecting charge and acceleration or something like that, then how do you get from the Platonic heaven down to real things? How do you explain why electrons, actual electrons, move the way they do? And so that led to this revival of the idea of causal powers, that particular individual things have powers which explain in their own terms, right, why they interact with each other in the way that they do. In a sense, it's a common sense idea, right? And a lot of Aristotle's ideas are common sense, but just developed in a certain way. And then, of course, from that, you then ask, well, why do things have the causal powers they do, and why do those powers persist in the way they do? And that led to talking about natural kinds, That is, that things out in nature belong to kinds. They have an essence or a real definition that makes them what they are. And part of that real definition is ascribing to them certain powers and potentialities, right? And this again was revived, I think, by David Wiggins in the 70s. He introduced this idea of sortals, which were an early notion of natural kinds, and that's become quite common. Kit Fine has done a lot of work on this, on reviving the idea of essences or real definitions, and this is a very Aristotelian sort of notion. So things belong to kinds; they have essences. Those kinds or essences give us causal powers, and the causal powers explain why they act the way they do. So laws of nature come in as just a way of summarizing these facts about natural kinds and powers, right? So the laws don't have some sort of independent reality above and beyond the particular things. It's particular things that have the powers and so on that they do. Now that, of course, raises questions about how you relate the particular to the universal, right? Because things do belong to natural kinds, and everything in that natural kind has a certain set of powers. How do we explain that, right? How do we explain the universality of these powers through a natural kind? And here's where Aristotle, very famously tries to steer a middle course or a third course that's an alternative both to Platonism on the one hand and to nominalism on the other hand, right? The Platonists would say that universals are separate, independent things of some kind in a sort of Platonic heaven, and that then they somehow impinge themselves on the particular world, or maybe they're actually incorporated into the world in some way. That raises lots of problems, I think, that Aristotle develops in some detail. So many philosophers went to the opposite extreme, and so there's nothing really universal in the world. There's only particular things. And the less radical version of that would be a kind of resemblance nominalism, which would say that at least resemblance relations are objective and natural, not conventional. But that leads to also some technical problems, actually, right? Perhaps the most basic one is that resemblance is a relation between two things, right? But if two things resemble each other, that should be because they are the way they are, right? Intrinsically, right? So the intrinsic facts about the thing should come before the resemblance relation, not vice versa. Whereas a nominalist says, well, they are the way they are because they resemble each other. That seems backwards, right? So I think Aristotle's view is, and this gets us into hylomorphism, is that individual particular things are in a way a result of something formal and something material. And so the thought is that, let's say you and I, or we four people are all human beings, right? So each of us have a human form. And that human form is individual. So I have my human form, you have your human form, Samir has his human form, and so on, right? So that's where it's not Platonism, right? There's not just a single human form itself, as it is in Plato. But here's the tricky thing. Aristotle, I think, is saying that our human forms are distinct, but not fundamentally distinct. They're only distinct because they're combined in the way they are with matter. So my matter and Samir's matter are fundamentally distinct, right? They're distinct from each other in a fundamental way, and they make our forms distinct, right? So my human form is distinct from Samir's because our matter is distinct, not vice versa, right? That means that there's a kind of would-be identity between our human forms. If my matter were the same as Samir's matter, and Samir's matter was the same as Thomas's matter, then our human forms would all be the same form, right? They're not intrinsically distinct. So that would-be identity is what unites all the forms into a single natural kind, right? And so it's not resemblance nominalism, right? Because it's something intrinsic about us that unites us into the form, into a kind. But it's not Platonism either, because the Platonic form does not remain a single thing up in heaven. It becomes particularized in each individual thing, right? So I think it's an ingenious solution. I'm working right now on sort of developing how Aristotle can then explain why this relation of being would-be identical is an equivalence relation. So it actually does organize things into kinds that are exhaustive and mutually exclusive, right? And you also get the whole, I'm arguing, you get the whole Porphyrian tree of species belonging to a genus and those genera belonging to a bigger genus and so on. You can get that out of this picture as well. So it's a pretty fruitful approach, I think, to understanding universals and particulars. Now, once you've got form and matter in the picture, then you have to sort of ask yourself, well, how many substances are there in the world? So a substance for Aristotle is a fundamentally real thing that then has a combination of form and matter in the way that I described. And you could be a kind of Aristotelian, sort of heretical Aristotelian, who thought that only the microscopic things are substances. John Hyle actually has a view like that, right? So quarks and electrons are substances and nothing else, right? That's not Aristotle's own view, right? Aristotle's view was anti-atomist in that sense. So he thought that things like you and me, organisms, are substances, right? And so that means that the relationship between wholes and parts is more complicated than it is in the usual anti-Aristotelian story, right? So there's actually two stories here, right? There's the atomistic story, in which the only fundamental things are the microscopic things, and everything else is really just a heap of those microscopic things. And then there's the cosmic monist picture, in which the only substance is the whole universe. That's sort of Spinoza. And you and I are just sort of fragments of the whole universe. And then there's this Aristotelian view in which it's the middle-sized stuff, like you and me and chunks of rock and bodies of water that are the substances, right? And that means that my parts depend on me and not vice versa. So even my electrons and quarks and so on, and atoms in my body persist through time and act the way they do fundamentally because they're a part of me, and my form, my human form, is governing them in some respects, right? So you get a nice solution, I think, to the mind-body problem on this picture, right? Because you don't have two independent things, a body and a mind, that have to somehow interact with each other. You rather have the mind has to do with your form, the soul, as Aristotle puts it, and it makes the body a body. So the physical aspect of us is dependent on, in a way, on the biological aspect of us, which includes our mental capacities and so on. So it's also a solution to the mind-body problem that avoids both materialism and reductive materialism on the one hand, and a kind of substance dualism on the other hand. It's again a third option that I think very attractive in lots of ways. So I've been going on quite a while, maybe.
Yeah. So it's fine. It's okay. So I do have a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
So in relation to universalism particulars, for example, William Jaworski, your colleague, who you probably know already, has argued for a view of trope resemblance nominalism as opposed to amendment realism when it comes to universals. He says that it's a simpler view because it doesn't commit Aristotelian to accepting any kind of universals, but rather just particulars, like bare particulars with these tropes, and that resemblance relation is sort of like brute. So why would you say that we would rather accept your amendment realist position rather than worse?
Yeah, no, good question. Right. So there's the reason I mentioned, right, which is that the resemblance nominalism seems to get the order of explanation wrong. That is, if I say, well, here are the red tropes. What makes them all red tropes? They resemble each other. That's what they say. But wait a minute, that's wrong. They resemble each other because they're all red tropes, right? You've got the order of explanation wrong, right? And I think that's a serious objection. The other objection that's sort of related to that is, I say, well, in order for this to work, resemblance would have to be reflexive, symmetrical, right? And also sort of transitive. That is, if A is exactly like B and B is exactly like C, then A should be exactly like C as well, right? Why is that? Resemblance nominalism has no explanation. That's a brute fact. And that's a huge brute fact, because that involves maybe infinitely many things in their resemblance relations all have to obey this law of transitivity. And he has no explanation for it whatsoever. Whereas both the Platonist and the Aristotelian have an explanation, right? That the Platonist is easy, right? They're all red because they all participate in the red thing, right? And that's obviously transitive, right? If X participates in the red thing and Y participates in the red thing and Z participates in the red thing, then X and Z are also resembling each other, right? But I think Aristotelian also has a solution, an explanation, right? In terms of would-be identity, right? If I would be identical to Zamir, if our matter were the same, if all the matter were the same, and Samir were identical to Thomas, right? Then since identity is obviously transitive, right? Similarly, you get the transitivity of resemblance. So that, to me, that's the main payoff that the Aristotelian gets. You also get some advantages, I think, in terms of explaining why, again, why species group themselves into genera and genera into supergenera. Again, the resemblance nominalist has no particular explanation for that fact, if it is a fact. I think it is. That's a bit more complicated. In fact, to go into the details of that would be a whole nother interview, I think. But
Of course.
but I think I'll just throw it out there. The Aristotelian does have a principal explanation for that in a way that neither the Platonist nor the Nominalist does. So that's a big advantage as well.
Yeah. Okay. So to the next thing. So you mentioned natural kinds. So you say that natural kinds, the way we classify substances is based on their causal powers, or should I say rather that they are teleologically ordered towards achieving a certain end?
Yeah.
So I guess this sort of the classic response to Aristotelian is that evolution has sort of got rid of the need for teleology in biology. Sort of that organisms typically randomly develop these traits rather than being ordered towards such and such development. So what would you say to such a response?
Yeah, good. So I have a lot of things to say. I think first of all, I would emphasize that for Aristotle, teleology is an immediate consequence of causal powers. So once you have any causal powers in your picture, you immediately have some kind of teleology. George Molnar has noticed this, and David Armstrong. They both talk about what they call physical intentionality or natural intentionality. That is, if I have an electron, right, and it's got a negative charge, so it has the power to repel other negatively charged things like other electrons. Well, you can have an electron out in deep space somewhere where it never encounters any other electron. It never will. It nonetheless has the power to repel electrons, right? That's teleology, right? Because it means that the electron is sort of saying, if I ever encounter an electron, I'm going to repel it, right? That's sort of built into the power that it has, right? So powers by themselves are necessarily forward-looking, right? They sort of say, this is what would happen under certain circumstances. And that is teleology. That's all there is to Aristotelian teleology, right? So then the question is, do biological things, organisms, have their own powers, or are they merely lumps of chemicals, molecules, and so on? That becomes the issue. And if you say, oh, no, there are no biological powers at all, then you're not doing evolutionary biology. You're not doing biology at all. You're saying there is no biology, right? It's all just chemistry and physics. So if the evolutionary biologist says, no, I believe in organisms, and organisms have the power to reproduce themselves, they better if evolution is going to work, right? Then you're already an Aristotelian, right? So in fact, modern biology is Aristotelian all the way through and through, right? I mean, for instance, if you take any article in biology, modern biology, take a page in any article, I will find you 80 places on that page where Aristotelian teleology is implicit in that article, right? If they talk about genes, what's a gene? A gene is something whose function is to encode information about building proteins. That's teleology, right? If you say, here's an enzyme, what's an enzyme? An enzyme is a protein whose function is to catalyze a certain reaction in the cell. That's teleology, and so on, right? Here's an organ. What's an organism? An organism is something that has a certain function in the cell, and so on. So everything you do in biology is thoroughly teleological in nature, right? And it would have to be because you're talking about powers of things, and powers are teleological. So that's my basic response. I mean, also, I'd argue that Aristotle's not really committed to a static picture of natural kinds that they never change. I mean, this raises a bigger question about Aristotle, right? Yeah. Because you have to distinguish between the core ideas in Aristotle, the secondary ideas in Aristotle, and the tertiary ideas, right? So, I mean, Aristotle believed that the heavens were filled with crystalline spheres that are rotating eternally, right? Well, that's wrong, but that's not a central part of Aristotle's story, right? That's something that's conjectural, right? That's the best hypothesis he could come up with at the time, and that's been falsified. That doesn't mean that you get rid of potentiality and substances and all the rest, right? And so in a similar way, of course, he thought that our biological world was a steady state universe, right? That the species never changed. That turned out to be wrong. No big deal, right? That's a tertiary aspect of his theory, not a primary one.
Yeah, so would there be any non-formulated ways to understand those biological concepts, such as kidneys or hearts or any other parts of the organisms?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, this is an example. What's a heart? A heart is an organ whose function is to pump blood, right? And there's no other definition of what a heart is. You try and define a heart in physical, chemical terms, it won't work. There'll be hearts that'll be counterexamples to your definition. The only thing that unites all the hearts in the biological world is the function of the heart. Likewise with the kidney and so on, right? If I have a kidney that doesn't work anymore, it's not cleaning the blood of urea, it's still a kidney, right? Because it still has a function of doing that, even if it doesn't actually succeed in doing it. And so the whole notion of disease, right, presupposes teleology. Damage, that presupposes teleology, and so on. So if you believe that there are species, right, whether you think that they change over time or not, a species is defined in terms of a set of functions, right? What makes something a member of a species is it's got the organs that are organized in such a way as to realize the characteristic way of life of that species, right? And so that's always going to be defined teleologically, ultimately.
Yeah, okay. So in relation to your position on Mereology, as you said, that you believe that there are these middle-sized objects, these substances, you, me, and so on. So this seems very similar to me to Inwagen's restricted compass view, where they are the only real things are organisms and these micro-physical things, and everything else is just heaps of matter or gunk. So would you say that that is sort of the position you're holding?
They're pretty close, but there is this difference, right? Is that in that Van Inwagen thinks that the simple things are also substances, right? So he thinks that there are all these electrons and quarks in my body, they're substances, and I'm also a substance, right? Whereas Aristotle would say, no, only I'm a substance. The quarks and electrons and so on in me are not substances at all. They're merely parts of me, right? Fragments of me. So I think the Aristotelian view is a little bit more radical, right? And this is maybe a point at which some people will find it hard to believe, right? That an individual electron or even an individual carbon atom, when I inhale it, doesn't really survive the process of being inhaled by me, right? It gets replaced by a new carbon atom that's part of me, right? So originally there was a carbon atom that was part of some inorganic substance in the air, right? And now there's a new one that becomes part of me. I don't think it's the same atom, actually. This gets into some difficulties, actually, but I would incline to say it's not, even though perhaps at some level we can say that the matter is the same during the process. So anyways, I think it's a bit more radical. So Van Inwagen still has a problem, I think, in terms of explaining the interaction, you might say, between me and my particles, right? And why isn't it the case that my particles just sort of take over and do everything, and I'm just along for the ride, so to speak? I'm not making any difference. Whereas the Aristotelian would say, no, I mean, I'm making a big difference, right? Because I'm organizing the body chemically, right? And the chemical properties are organizing the body microphysically. And so there's a lot of top-down formal causation going on my picture that I don't think Van Inwagen actually has in his story.
Yeah, so in that case, we just say that substances, like any proper parts, for example, Anna Marmodoro, another Neo-Aristotelian, argues that, for example, form is a part of substance. We just say that we have no proper parts at all.
Well, okay, so I definitely would say that we don't have another substance as a proper part, right? That, I think, is a pretty deep commitment of Aristotle. Now, some Aristotelians, and actually Marmodoro, except for the form thing, Marmodoro, I think, does think this, and Proust, at least as time has thought this, that I don't have any material proper parts, right? That I don't really, my hand is not a thing. Just me being handy over here, so to speak. There's just me everywhere. And I think that's an interesting position. I don't think it's Aristotle's position exactly. It's maybe compatible with other Aristotelian commitments. So I'm more inclined to go a little less radical there and say, oh, I do have parts, but they're not substantial parts. They're parts that are in some deep sense dependent on me for their nature, whereas I'm not dependent on anything else for my nature in that same way. Right? I'm something complete and self-explanatory in some sense. I think that's the picture. Now, whether form is a part of that's also a tricky issue. I'm inclined to say not exactly, right? I mean, Aristotle himself talks about the composite, the synalon in Greek, of form and matter. And so you might say, well, that's clearly committing himself to the idea that the form and the matter are, in some sense, parts of me. But I'm not sure that that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's better to think of the form as a kind of factor or principle that explains why I am and why I am the way I am. And the matter is more or less just me transformed by the form. So it's not so much that there are two things that are combined to make me. It's rather there are sort of two metaphysical factors, you might say, which are combined in such a way as to produce me, where I'm fundamentally a single thing. It's fundamentally simple at some level.
Yeah. So I think at this point we can move on to other Aristotelian topics. Another thing that you said that is very important for being an Aristotelian is a certain perspective on natural theology, time, modality, and even certain positions on quantum mechanics. So I give you
to say.
the floor.
Yeah. So obviously Aristotle himself believes in some kind of God, and that's pretty explicit in lots of his works. Most of the people in this Neo-Aristotelian revolution, like Kit Fine and folks like that, don't go there. They don't talk about Aristotle's natural theology. But I think we're going to see more of it as passes, because it is once you've got this metaphysical foundation of Aristotle in place, you have all the resources you need, I think, to develop a pretty interesting theology. And it's going to be a kind of classical theism, to use that term. Jonathan Foucault and I just edited a book called Classical Theism, where we collect together a bunch of articles on this sort of thing. And I've got a chapter in that book where I say, does the God of classical theism exist? And I basically just give 3 or 4 Aristotelian arguments for thinking that it does, including Aquinas' first way, which hasn't been much defended recently. Ed Feser's got a defense of it, but I've got my own defense, really, my own interpretation of it, which is, again, focused on time. So the idea is that on Aristotle's picture, time is not some quasi-spatial dimension, right? It's not like just a 4th dimension of space, right? It's rather the measure of change or the measure of motion. So for time to pass, motion or change has to happen, right? Which means that in Aristotle's picture, you can take for granted that time passes. Why is time passing, right? What makes time pass? What makes time progress? And Aristotle's argument, I think, and Thomas picks this up, is that you can't explain that from within time itself, right? In other words, time can explain why things are the way they are at a particular moment, but it can't explain why there's another moment after that, right? For that, you need something outside of time to impose a temporal structure on things and to keep the motion happening, so to speak, repeatedly over time. So that's my sort of take on the first way, that already Aristotle's conception of time and motion forces us into believing into a timeless or eternal being who's causally responsible for time's progression. And that already moves us a long ways towards theism, of course. And then ultimately, this prime mover, as Aristotle puts it, is also responsible for the whole organization of the universe and for its existence, right? And so that gets us into the second way and the third way, right? That the prime mover is a necessary being who has chosen to create a world like this and who's therefore causally responsible for its existence. My take on this, too, is that what Aristotle is really saying is that if something is causable, then it has a cause. And so that forces you to an uncausable thing. And that's the prime mover, God, again, the thing that couldn't be caused anyway. So that's a quick picture of that. Now, on the quantum mechanics stuff, this is something I've actually been working on a lot in the last 8 or 9 years. And I've got some new collaborators. I mean, Alex Prusa contributed to this, and one of my colleagues, William Simpson, has done some work on this. He's got a new book from Cambridge University Press on this. So, there are many interpretations of quantum mechanics. And that itself is an interesting fact, because there weren't many interpretations of Newton or Maxwell. I mean, it was pretty clear, right? But then you get to the quantum revolution, and suddenly it's really puzzling what's going on. My take is that if we'd had the quantum revolution in the 17th century, if immediately after Newton you'd had Bohr and Schrodinger and so on, then people would never have abandoned Aristotle. They would have said, oh, we need Aristotle to explain all this, right? And there wouldn't be any mystery. So the Aristotelian interpretation would actually have made sense with quantum mechanics right at the beginning. But since there was this time gap, by the time we got the quantum revolution in the early 20th century, people had more or less forgotten Aristotle. And so they didn't know about potentiality and powers and so on, substances. And so they didn't have the vocabulary they needed to make sense of the quantum phenomena. And this is why you get all these weird interpretations resulting from it. But here's one simple point to make, right? In the Newtonian picture of the world, you don't need to talk about potentialities or possibilities at all. You just need to let things in space, right? Add the laws of nature, progress those things through the actual world. You just need the actual world. Any other possibility is merely a thought experiment, right? And that's nothing to do with reality. In the quantum world, you have to say, what are all the possible ways in which these particles can interact? And those potentialities are part of the theory, right? The theory is that probabilities are fluctuating in the realm of potentiality all the time. And so you have to take potentiality realistically, which is exactly what Aristotle does. So in fact, Aristotle was sort of anticipating the quantum realm, you might say, by putting this emphasis on potentiality. So anyway, to finish up this idea, I think Bohr came the closest to Aristotle, actually, in that he realized that quantum mechanics is metaphysically incomplete. It's sort of scientifically complete or physically complete, but it's metaphysically incomplete because of the measurement problem. That is, what quantum mechanics tells us is not how the microparticles are, but rather what they would do when they interact with us or with our instruments, right? So the microphysical is not complete. It's pointing to something beyond it. It's saying, here's the essence of an electron. It's a kind of thing that interacts with larger things in certain ways with certain probabilities. So you need those larger things in the picture, right? And you can't reduce those to the microphysical. They've got to have their own independent existence, right? And so that's the idea, right? That you need substances, including you and me and our instruments. Those substances have causal powers that enable us to interact with the quantum world. The quantum world reveals itself in this probabilistic way through these instruments. And that's the basic interpretation. So I think it's a very natural, again, in fact, I think all actual experimental physicists are implicitly Aristotelian, really, right? They're approaching it in exactly the way Aristotle would recommend that you think about it. And it's only the philosophers who then try to escape this with some kind of crazy interpretation, like many worlds or Bohmian or whatever, which I think GRW, which involve a bunch of speculations that aren't really there in the physics.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think I'll have some questions regarding the natural theology. So there's this big part of arguing against like a Thomistic conception of classical theism, where the big argument is that of existential inertia, and there's no need for this prime mover to sort of sustain these jobs in existence.
Yeah, so I think that's this idea of existential inertia is part of what we might call the traditional interpretation of the first and second way. And the interpretation that I'm developing right now, Dan Bonavec, one of my colleagues, and I are working on a new book on the 5 ways. It's a new interpretation that basically gets rid of existential altogether. So it become completely irrelevant. So I basically could agree with Joe. And in fact, I probably do agree with Joe on thinking that there's not really any good reason to believe in the absence of existential inertia in any sense. So basically, the first way, so I'd have to break it down to the first and second way. The first way, I think, is about the progression of time, okay? Inertia doesn't satisfy that problem, right? Inertia of any kind, whether existential or just good old-fashioned Newtonian inertia, says, if time progresses in a certain way, and I'm already in motion, then I will continue to be in motion as time progresses, right? So it's a conditional or hypothetical claim, right? It's not saying time will progress. It just says if time does progress, I'll continue on a straight line of inertial motion, right? So the first way is saying, well, yeah, but wait a minute, but why does time progress? What makes time move forward? For that, you need a prime mover, right? So inertia has nothing to do with it, completely irrelevant to the first way. The second way is about existence. Why do things exist? It has nothing to do with time. And this is where the traditional Thomists go wrong. They think that it has to do with time, that somehow the claim is that at each moment, God has to do something to keep things in existence. Okay, so Thomas does believe that. He believes that you need divine conservation, but he doesn't get to proving that until 50 questions later in the Summa, right? That he finally comes around, I think, or maybe more. That's like 100, like question 104, I think, in the first part. Whereas we're the 5 ways are in question 2, right? So it's 102 questions later, thousands of articles later, he finally gets to that claim. So to think that he's presupposing that in the second way is crazy, right? So the second way depends on this idea that you need conservation of things. It's really just talking about why do things exist at all, right? So I interpret the second way in a much more Leibnizian way here, that has nothing to do with time. It's just, why do things exist at all? Again, inertia is completely irrelevant to that question. Existential inertia, that doesn't answer the question of why the thing's there at all. And if it's, for instance, if it's a body, it's a combination of form and matter, right? It's therefore causable, right? If it's causable, it must have a cause. And something that forces you to a first cause, right? So my way of interpreting first and second way make existential inertia in each case just irrelevant. So it's a they're good responses to the traditional Thomism, but not relevant to my version of Thomism.
Yeah, so I think David Oderberg has something related to this, and he calls that a tendency dispositionism, where he says that objects stay in existence in virtue of having this sort of power that keeps them from going out of existence.
Yeah.
So is that
right.
is that something that you hold?
Yeah, I think so. It's a tricky issue, I think. So yeah, I do think that things have a tendency to exist, and so if time progresses and nothing interferes with them, they will continue to exist, right? Now, you might say, okay, then am I denying the idea that you need to have, that God has to conserve things in existence, which again, Thomas does say in question 104. I don't think so, because again, we have to be careful here. To say that God conserves things in existence, we don't want to say that at each moment, God has a separate action of conserving the universe at that moment, because that puts God in time. And now God is not the prime mover anymore. Now God is being carried along by time, just like the rest of us. And so he can't explain the progress of time, and he's not eternal, right? So instead, what we have to say is that God is eternal, right? In a single act, he causes the universe to exist throughout time, right? Now, is it the case that if he didn't intend us to exist right now, we wouldn't exist now? Yes, of course. So in that sense, he conserves us in existence, but not in the sense that somehow he gave us some kind of existence that would sort of naturally poop out before we got to now, and he had to kind of keep pumping it up as each moment progresses. That's the wrong conception of conservation, I think. And that's, again, unfortunately, many Thomists do take that interpretation of it, as though somehow God kind of blows a certain amount of existence into things, but it expires, and he has to keep doing it over and over again to keep things going. I think that's the wrong picture. That's not. I don't think that's really an Aristotelian or even a Thomistic picture. It works.
Yeah. So when we were on the topic of time, there's quite a lot of views on the Aristotelian notion of time. So I've seen some from like Alexander Proust, who endorses the P theory, eternalism. There is the Aristotelian sort of what was it, presentism, and there's just a lot of these views. So I believe that you yourself hold to this view of sort of like a growing block view. So could you explain that?
Yeah. This is a bit which I have to say I'm not yet satisfied with any of the views that are out there, including my own. So this is a point where I'm very much still in flux myself. So I try to interpret Aristotle as much as I can in a way that's neutral on these different issues, so that you could combine it with a B theory or an A theory, even presentism, if you want to. So what I think is essential to Aristotle is, again, that time is not a spatial dimension. It's a measure of motion or change, right? And therefore, in some sense, it has to be a sort of dynamic view of time, right? As opposed to a kind of block universe picture of time. Now, whether you can still have a dynamic B theory is, I think, an interesting question. I've actually published a couple of articles where I've tried to develop such a dynamic B theory, a more Aristotelian version of the B theory. I think it is possible, but I'm not sure it's right yet. I'm still puzzling it through. I mean, my only real problem with the B theory is that it seems to me to make my subjective experience of the sequential passage of time into a kind of illusion in a way, because my past, present, and future selves are already there, so to speak, right? Eternally. And yet I sort of feel like, I just was doing something else and I will do something else in the future. And there's something deeply metaphysically real about that progression in a way that it's hard for me to see how the B theory accommodates that. So that's my only reservation about the B theory, but it's not a real knockdown argument. It's just a kind of feeling of dissatisfaction of some kind. So I try, as I say, at the moment, I'm trying to develop a dynamic B theory, or a kind of, if I'm pressed to the A theory, I'm disinclined to be a presentist. I'm more inclined to be some kind of eternalist atheist, like maybe some version of the moving spotlight kind of a picture, or say a growing block. I don't want to be a growing block theory particular, because there you lose the distinction really between the present and the past. The present and past are all sort of equally actual, so to speak. And then the worry is, how do I know that this is really the present, right? How do I know that I'm actually not a billion years in the past right now, right? And that the leading edge of reality is way out there, in what I think of as the future. So there's sort of epistemological problems there. I guess what I've said in my most recent work is that it seems to me that Aristotle has to think of actuality as, in some sense, time indexed. So in other words, there's different kinds of actuality corresponding to each moment in time. Again, that's maybe a dynamic version of the B theory in a way. So it's not just a single timeless kind of actuality that applies to everything in a uniform sort of way. There's rather sort of different modes of actuality that apply at moments in time. And so we're actual sub T, whatever this moment T is, right? And so when I think about the future, I can't actually access those future modes of actuality. They're kind of cognitively impenetrable to me, whereas I can't access the past modes of actuality through memory. And so that gives us kind of asymmetry, right? And likewise, from the point of view of the actual moment of actual sub T, things that are actual in earlier points of time are now fixed, whereas what might be actual in the future is open. So you get a kind of branching picture. So actually, yeah, if I were an A theorist, I think rather than a growing block, I'd be more of a falling branches kind of a picture, if you know that story. So you kind of got this tree with lots of branches, and the branches sort of falling off as time progresses. That's closer to my view, I think. But I'm not satisfied with any of them yet, so I'm still working on it.
Yeah, I've read your paper on the dynamic B theory of time. Mm-hmm. You're trying to develop it. It was a bit confusing times with the branching stuff.
Yeah.
But I quite enjoyed it, and that reminds me of the Aristotelian view of modality, because it is this branching actualism. Right. Graham Oppy as well defends such view, of course. Right. But I'm sure you would have some disagreements about that. Could you tell us a little bit about your view of modality?
Yeah. So actually, it's an interesting point, because it is a point where Graham Oppy and I are in pretty close agreement, actually, right? And that I think we both adopted a Aristotelian picture of reality, which is that the possible worlds, merely possible worlds, are all branching off of the actual world in some sense, right? So that gives a kind of primacy to the actual world, right? It's the ground for all the possibilities ultimately that there are, and but it's not. So in that sense, it's not like David Lewis's picture, where all the possible worlds are on a par. They're just parallel universes that are all equally real. On this picture, no, there's only one real world, right? And the merely possible worlds are worlds that could have happened because they could have been the result of exercising of powers that just weren't exercised at some point in the past, where you have like probabilistic powers that could have been exercised and weren't, right? So that's the picture. Now, the difference, I guess we'll get into that in a minute when we talk about the Kalam thing, right? Is on my view, course, time had a beginning. And so there's an ultimate root to the whole tree, so to speak, which is God, God in eternity. And God, chose which kind of universe to start. And then from then on, you get, the very possibilities branching off from that, right? So the world, our space-time world, could have been radically different all the way back to the beginning, because God is the ultimately actual necessary being, right? Who chose how the universe should start, so to speak, right? Whereas Oppie doesn't, he's a naturalist, right? So there's nothing beyond the space-time continuum to be the ultimate root, so to speak, of it. And that produces lots of problems for his account, actually, right? Sort of unintuitive results of it. So suppose there's exactly, 7 gazillion ergs of energy in the universe, and suppose there's a law of conservation of energy. Then Oppie has to say it's metaphysically impossible. There should be 7 gazillion and 1 ergs of energy, right? That seems wrong, right? Why couldn't there have been just 1 more erg of energy all along, or 1 less? But he has to know, impossible, because no matter how far back you go, there's always exactly 7 gazillion ergs of energy, right? And so that seems counterintuitive, right, to me. Whereas on my picture, of course, there could have been, because God could have created 7 gazillion and 1 ergs of energy, right? So there's a much wider scope for possibility on my picture. And that seems to be closer to our intuitive idea of metaphysical possibility, I think. Not a knockdown argument, but it's a worry for an Oppie-like picture, I think.
So would you say that solves sort of the problem for the truth makers regarding the possibility and actuality? So the truth of the possibilities are sort of grounded in the causal powers of things, rather than in some non-existing or some other, like David Lewis's, concrete worlds or use of those sorts.
Well, Lewis definitely has truth makers. He doesn't have any problem with truth makers. But if you were an actualist, let's say, strict actualist, you thought there was only the actual world and no powers, right? Then I don't know what the ground truth maker for possibility would be. It would be really hard to see how that's going to work. So yeah, that's part of the big motivation for the alien picture.
Okay, so now we are going to switch over and be talking about the Kalam and all the work that Dr. Koons has done on this particular argument, particularly in regards to causal finitism and the Grim Reaper, along with the Patchwork principle. Before we jump in, do you have any thoughts on the dialectic of the Kalam and causal finitism, and any worries raised by the various objectors to your arguments regarding the Kalam?
Yeah. Thanks, Thomas. So I should say there's a little irony here, right? Because Aristotelianism is not really committed to causal finitism as a general rule. I don't think Aristotle was. I don't think Thomas was either. And I wasn't really until a few years ago. I thought, causal finitism, why think that? But then when I was working on the Grim Reaper paradox, really sort of unrelated to theology, actually, I just realized, wow, there's actually an interesting argument here for a kind of finite past, finite causal background. And so I wrote it up and sent it off and I published it. So for me, it's not really, it's kind of a secondary or supportive argument for my natural theology. It's not something I would be primarily running on, but it's gotten a lot of attention, and that's fine. I still think I think it's a good argument, right? I think it's useful to look at. I wasn't very impressed with the first round of objections, frankly. So I didn't even respond to them. I just thought they weren't very good. But now there's this sort of second round, you might say, are much better. And this new Malpass Schmid paper, for instance, is quite good. And so I'm going to need to start responding. This will be actually my first time to respond to those arguments. So you guys are scooping the world here, so to speak. and my response is somewhat preliminary too, because I haven't really thought through all of this deeply. I will say, though, that right off the bat, I knew as I published the article that the weakest link in the argument was the patchwork principle, right? This idea that you can, if you have a bunch of an event that's possible intrinsically, right, and you have enough space and time to repeat it over and over again, including infinitely many times, if that's enough room, then there should be a possible world where you actually do that. You repeat the event over and over and over again to fill in the slots in the quilt, right? So the patchwork principle, the picture here from David Lewis is you've got a kind of frame in which you're building a quilt. And you have a bunch of patches, and you put the patches in there and you stitch them together and make your quilt, right? And so the patches are the individual bits of possible event, so to speak. The frame is the spatio-temporal structure that's possible. So and so the idea is that if you have a structure that's possible and you have a patch that's possible, then you can just put the patch in to fill in the frame, and you've got a quilt. That's also possible. That is a possible world result, right? And so the thought is, if there's a possible world where the past is infinite, and therefore there's an infinite causal regress in that world, right? Or at least a possible causal regress, and you've got a little story about Grim Reapers sending messages to each other, then there should be a third possible world where that Grim Reaper story is repeated over and over again all the way into the infinite past, right? And that produces a contradiction, of course, a logical contradiction, if you assume that the Reapers all behave the way they're supposed to behave, right? And maybe the simplest model, again, just to get this out here so people, in case they haven't read the paper, know what we're talking about. The simplest model is that each Reaper has a number from 1 to infinity, right? And the last Reaper is 1, the one before him is 2, the one before him is 3, and so on to infinity, right? The Reaper's task is to take a piece of paper from his predecessor. If it's got a number on it already that's greater than his number, he just passes it on to his successor. If it's has some other kind of on it, he erases it, puts his number on, and passes it on to his successor, right? And so then the question is, when Grim Reaper 1 is done and he hands us the paper, does it have a number on it? And the answer is, well, of course it does, because at least it's going to have 1 on it if nothing else happened, right? And so it'll have some number on it. So what number will it be? Will it be number n? Well, it can't be number n, because if it's number n, right, then n must have gotten a blank piece of paper from his predecessor or something else like that, which means that n plus 1 should have gotten a blank piece of paper from his predecessor, which means this 1 would have put his number on it, not n. And we get a contradiction, right? So there should be a number, but there can't be any number, right? So there's a contradiction there. Now I realized all along, of course, that the possibility of the Grim Reaper is not really in question, right? I mean, we could build a machine that does this, right? It takes a piece of paper, checks to see if there's a number on it. If there is, if there is, it spits out the piece of paper. If there isn't, it writes its number on it. I mean, that should be no problem. So the only weak point, so to speak, of the argument would be the patchwork principle itself, right? That is, if there's an infinite past, and if the Grim Reaper is possible, does it really follow that there should be a possible world in which the Grim Reaper fills in the whole past in this way? And of course, as I I realized, as an anti-Humean myself, I'm going to want to restrict the patchwork principle in various ways, right? So in particular, if something has a power to act in a certain way, and it's a deterministic power, and the conditions of the power are all met, then it must act in that way, right? And so you can't just patch in another, create a new world where you just patch in some other result, right? So if I got a hammer and I'm a nail hammerer, right? And you give me a nail and I start to hammer it, then the nail should go into the piece of wood, right? There shouldn't be a possible world where I hammer the nail and the nail disappears or it doesn't go into the wood, right? That should be impossible. And likewise, even a principle of causality. So things don't just pop into existence out of nowhere. But again, if you had an unrestricted patchwork principle, you could just patch me into an empty world, and there I am. I just appear out of nowhere with no cause, and that's not possible either. So there are definitely going to be some restrictions to it. But my position is that any such restriction should be principled. That is, you should have some independent reason for the restriction, right? So if you think, look, causal powers are real, I've got good reason to believe in causal powers, then I should restrict the patchwork principle in a way that respects the exercise of causal powers. And similarly, if I think that everything has to have a cause, an adequate cause, then I should restrict the patchwork principle in such a way that everything in the story has an adequate cause, right? I think if you restrict the patchwork principle in those two ways, you can still get an infinite Grim Reaper paradox, right? Because there's nothing in the story that requires anything to happen that isn't properly caused, or that allows for something to have a power not to exercise it, or requires that something has a power not exercise it. So in fact, those restrictions don't affect the argument ultimately. Now, you can always just say, well, I'm just going to carve out some arbitrary restrictions to the patchwork principle. I'm going to say, You can use the patchwork principle, except in Grim Reaper-like cases, and then you can't, right? You can always do that, but then you have to, here's the choice, right? Do we reject the possibility of an infinite past and an infinite causal regress, or do we restrict the patchwork principle in some sort of arbitrary way? You have to make a choice. So the objector should give us some reason to believe that an infinite past and an infinite regress is really possible. And none of the objectors have done that, as far as I can see. None of them has offered any positive reason for thinking that's possible. And in fact, lots of us for thousands of years have thought that that's probably not possible, right? It seems pretty weird to think that there should be a causal infinite regress. So there's nothing on that side. And they just say, well, you can always just restrict the patchwork principle. Well, yeah, you can. but is that a good methodology in physics, right? To take a principle that we really need and then just arbitrarily carve pieces out of it to avoid an objection, to avoid a conclusion you don't like, right? Especially a conclusion for which you have no counter argument, right? That's the point, right? So I think it's just a question here of methodology, metaphysics, right? Is it enough in metaphysics to be able to say, I've got a logically consistent position, Well, sure. I mean, you can be a logically consistent atheist, no question, right? But can you be a good metaphysician and be a logically consistent atheist? That's the question. I think that so far I've really been engaged.
Yeah, that was all very good. So this is you actually touched on this, but I was going to ask. So Alex Malpass, very good philosopher, in a 2022 Prosblogian blog, argues your 2014 formulation of the Kalam is an argument for no one because it contains objectionable premises for humans and non-humans. And he characterizes that as either thinking there is no fundamental necessity connecting spatiotemporal non-overlapping events and portions of space-time. So this is for the human. Or that there is this fundamental nature there is this fundamental necessity in nature. So this is the non-human, right? And so he says humans, they will reject the possibility of individual reapers because they have this, what he calls thick modal properties, like power and disposition to kill Fred under right conditions. And the non-humans, they will reject the, what he says, your unrestricted patchwork principle. You kind of touched on this, because it violates thick modal notions. And he gives the example of a glass with the thick modal property of fragility and disposition to shatter if, say, thrown on the ground, thrown on concrete, something like this. And then he goes to say that the patchwork principle violates this, or at least your version, because you can sort of copy and paste together these regions of space-time where the glass is thrown with ones where it's unbroken on the floor, right? And I was thinking, like, if you had anything further, you kind of touched on it, but if you had further thoughts on this dilemma.
Yeah, right. So he's right. And I actually, in the original article, I pointed out that Humeans could reject the argument, right? Because the way I would put it is the Humean should say, look, when I describe the Grim Reaper story, I'm not describing it intrinsically anymore about power. Because on a Humean picture, to attribute a power to something is to describe the whole universe, right? And how things are patterned in that whole universe, right? And so it's not an intrinsic characteristic of the Grim Reaper, right? I got maybe the same thing he's saying with thick versus thin modal properties, right? So for the Humean, you'd have to say, well, before we talk about whether Grim Reapers have powers or not, you have to tell me the whole story of the universe, right? And so then I have to tell you the whole story, and now there's no contradiction, because I either say, Grim Reaper N wrote his number and nobody else did, or nobody wrote their number. And then the answer is going to be, well, then nobody has these powers, right? Because they didn't exercise them, right? So the Humean definitely has a way out. Now, the more interesting question is, what about the anti-Humean, right? So again, Malpass is right. The anti-Humean can't accept an unrestricted patchwork principle for the reason he mentions, right? Because there's a possible world where the glass is not broken tomorrow. There's a possible world where I throw the glass against the concrete, right? Is there a possible world where I throw the glass against the concrete, it's fragile, and it isn't broken tomorrow? No, right? Because the powers, when they're exercised, have manifestations, right? Necessarily, in some sense, or at least possibly necessarily, right? Necessarily, possibly have a manifestation or something like that. So there's some kind of modal connection there, which a Humean won't allow for. But again, my response is going to be say, yeah, but it would be a mistake to say that if you're a non-Humean, you don't need any kind of patchwork principle at all, because you do. I think all of us need some kind of patchwork principle, or else we would be completely blind modally, so to speak. We'd be unable to ever say what's possible, right? Because if I were to say it's possible for me, it was possible for me to drive to Ohio yesterday, right? Why do I think that? Well, because I've driven to Ohio in the past, right? And I had the power to drive yesterday, right? And so I sort of patch those together and I construct a possible world where I drive to Ohio yesterday. So if I didn't have any kind of patchwork principle, I would never be able to say anything about what's possible. That would be epistemologically, disastrous. So everybody needs a patchwork principle of some kind. So the question is, what restrictions on it do you give? And my main concern, my main objection here, or counter objection here, is that I don't think that Malpass or Schmid or anybody has proposed yet a patchwork principle that both has some teeth in it and enables us to know things about what's possible and doesn't lead to Grim Reaper-like paradoxes, given an infinite past, right? That's sort of my position. And so, if they can propose such a principle, then I could consider it, but so far no one's come up with one, because I put it that way.
Yeah, and on a similar note, there's a question about whether a Humean who accepts Hume's dictum can accept causal finitism at all, because it seems to you might accept the patchwork principle because of Hume's dictum, the idea that there are no necessary connections between distinct existences. But if you say there are no necessary connections between these existences, then that seems to conflict with causal finitism, which seems like it's going to be a necessary connection on causal chains in most distinct existences.
Yeah,
so
I don't know. I think a Humean could accept causal finitism. Suppose a Humean thought that in every possible world the past is finite, and he thinks, as Humeans do, that causes are always precede their effects in time, right? Then that would probably, well, I guess he'd also have to assume some things about the possible density of events and so on. So maybe, and Hume, I think, did think this, right? That there were sort of minimal units of time or minimal units of change that were metaphysically necessary. So you could put all that together, and you could still believe in causal finitism and be Humean, but you couldn't use the Grim Reaper argument to get there. I think that's the main point, right? You'd have to have some other reason for believing in it as a Humean.
Gotcha.
At least I don't see any direct argument here from Humeanism to the possibility of an infinite regress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then this next objection is a little bit different. So in supplementation, Malpass, Morriston, and Schmid have this objection where you can't do a causal finitist paradox because the information that must be passed between the reapers is extrinsic. So they say, in order for the quilted world to be paradoxical, the reapers need successfully transformation from one to another. But this successful transmission is a fact extrinsic to each reaper and the region it occupies. And your version of the patchwork principle only warrants you to recombine intrinsic features of the principle. So the patchwork principle cannot generate the paradox because it cannot generate the information passing. Of course, one could add the auxiliary hypothesis in the patched together worlds that all reapers transmit their signals successfully, but then we could simply take the contradiction as a reductio of that assumption, and not the assumption that an infinite past is possible. So what do you make of this move?
Yeah, I don't think this is really a successful objection in my view. So the patches are going to be regions of space-time, right? And in particular, in this case, it's regions of time that matter most, right? That is, there's a kind of a beginning of the grouper ends period and an end of grouper ends period, right? And then there's a beginning of grouper n plus one and the end of Reaper plus one, so on. So the question is, what's the relationship between the end of Reaper n period and the beginning of Reaper n+1's period, right? Well, they could either, I mean, this gets into some details about the structure of time, right? It could be, as Brentano thought, that you actually have two coincident boundaries, which occur at exactly the same instant of time, one of which is the end of Reaper n's period, and the other is the beginning of Reaper n+1's period. They're still intrinsic to those two periods, even though they coincide in time. Or if you don't believe that, you could go with a open-closed interval kind of picture, where there's no last moment of Reaper n's period, but there is a first moment of Reaper n+1's period, right? Or vice versa, right? You could have a last period of Reaper n's period and no first period of Reaper n+1 period, but there's no gap between them, right? They approach each other perfectly, right? So now the question is, if Reaper n has a certain power to act, right? And he has that power all up to this boundary, right? And Reaper n+1 has a certain potentiality to be acted on. And he has that right at the very beginning of his period, right? So the power, the active power and the passive power are contiguous in time, right? Then on a causal powers picture, the active power will cause the potentiality to be realized in the n+1. So even though they don't overlap, they're contiguous, right? And if they have real powers and potentialities, passive and active potentialities, right, then you will get a transmission. So there's no further stipulation that's required to make that work.
Yeah, that was very good. So the UPDs, right? They say this. Hey, look, we can add other conditions to our patchwork principle, like Lewis already did, like geometric, topological, spatiotemporal compatibility, on and on and on. Why cannot we add ours, right? Namely that the framework or the quilt doesn't have this logically inconsistent structure, right? And you touched on this a little bit too. And so we can ask this question: would an exception to the patchwork principle require a causal explanation, right? And if so, why? And another question to follow: wouldn't the UPDists similarly have a causal explanation for their exception, since by necessity or necessarily a logical possibility, it will causally constrain the space of metaphysical possibilities?
Right. Yeah. As you say, UPD, that's the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, right? This was the sort of round one objection, which I didn't think much of and still don't think much of, to be honest. So I think it doesn't really understand the logical structure of the situation. So the patchwork principle has the following form, right? It says something like this: if A is possible and B is possible, then C is possible, right? A is a certain kind of spatial temporal structure is possible, and B, the individual Grim Reaper patch is possible. The C, the Grim Reaper paradoxical world, is also possible, right? Now that principle is logically equivalent to the principle: if C is impossible, then either A is impossible or B is impossible, right? So in other words, thinking about that way, it's a principle that tells you, give me some impossibilities and I will give you some other impossibilities, right? So the fact that the Grim Reaper paradox is impossible is not a bug, it's a feature of the argument, right? That's the whole point, right? Is that we know that the Grim Reaper is logically impossible, right? Therefore, the patchwork principle says if C is impossible, then A has to be impossible or B has to be impossible. But B isn't impossible, obviously, because Grim Reapers are possible. Therefore, A must be impossible, the infinite past, right? That's the picture. So to say, well, so what they're really saying is, okay, you can't apply this argument to cases where C is logically impossible, only to where it's impossible in some other way. And I'm going to say, why? Why should you think that? And secondly, the Grim Reaper story isn't logically impossible, right? It's only logically impossible when you add some assumptions about causal powers. And in addition, I mean, if I describe the Grim Reaper paradox as saying there's just a series starting with 1, 2, and 3, and so on, I don't say how long the series is. That's logically possible. It's only when I add that it's infinite and beginningless that you get a logical impossibility, right? So I think this isn't really makes sense, right? So in other words, you have to, I guess here's the puzzle, right? That you can apply the Patrick principle, but only if the impossibility of C is not due to its logical inconsistency with causal powers ontology, right? Only in that case you can't apply it. But why? Why not? Right? Well, why should we carve out that particular restriction? Right? Here's another way to put it. Right? To say that a scenario is logically inconsistent in this context really means it's not really logically right. It's logically inconsistent with certain metaphysical necessities, like necessity about how causal powers are exercised. But to be logically inconsistent with a metaphysical necessity is just to be metaphysically impossible. That's just what metaphysical impossibility is, right? So now they're saying you can't apply the patchwork principle to any metaphysical impossibility. But then there's no patchwork principle, because the patchwork principle is logically equivalent to saying if C is metaphysically impossible, then blah, blah, blah. And if you can never apply it to a case where it's metaphysically impossible, then you can't apply it at all, right? So there's sort of a dilemma here. Either you would end up with a completely toothless or vacuous patchwork principle that has no force whatsoever, or you have to very arbitrarily carve out a particular case of impossibilities and say it doesn't apply there. And now I'll go back to my earlier point, which is, okay, what's the motive? What's the argument for carving out this special case, this special exception, right? That is, if you have a principle that's really important to us epistemologically, then you can't just sort of mutilate that principle by carving out exceptions for no good reason. You have to give an argument for the carving out of the exceptions, right? And that's what no one has done so far, as far as I can see. They haven't given me any reason to think that a causal regress is possible. And in the absence of any positive reason for thinking that, I've got no reason to mutilate the patchwork principle, right? Patchwork principle is important. So it gives us a good reason to think that infinite regresses are impossible. And we're still waiting for a good response from the other side.
Gotcha. All right. So I heard you mention earlier that you thought that the recent paper from Malpass and Joe Schmid, branching actualism and cosmological arguments, was quite good. So I wanted to discuss that now. And for those who aren't aware, the argument specific to causal finitism goes something like this. If branching actualism is true, then all possible worlds share a history with the actual world. Premise 2, if the patchwork principle is true, then not all possible worlds share a history with the actual world. And then the conclusion, so if branching actualism is true, then the patchwork principle is false. And branching actualism is something that many Neo-Aristotelians would find highly attractive. So I was wondering if I can get your response to that.
Yeah, so the nice thing about this article, is, as I mentioned earlier, is that that Alex Proust and I both are branching actualists in a sense, right? So it's fair game, right, to rely on that as an objection to this sort of this argument, and it does advance the dialectic, I think, in interesting ways, right? So it's a very helpful contribution to the dialogue. So yeah, I mean, first of all, again, I think I should say that this overlaps with our last point, which is they're right that branching actualism is incompatible with an unrestricted patchwork principle, right? Because if the patchwork principle were completely unrestricted, then I could patch together a world where there was no branch point at all, right, with the actual world, and that's going to be impossible, right? So that's right. But the question is, so let's say we restrict the patchwork principle in that way, right? So in other words, we can't just throw the patchwork principle away, right? As I said, because then we'd be modally blind. We wouldn't be able to know what's possible. So we need some kind of patchwork principle. So instead of just throwing it away, we should restrict it. We should say, okay, if the possible world does branch off the world at some point, and the other conditions are met, then you've got a possible world, right? So you just add another condition, a proviso, to the patchwork principle. So now the question is, does that proviso eliminate the patchwork principle, right, all by itself, without adding causal finitism? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It doesn't at all, right? We still get the patchwork principle. We still get the Grim Reaper paradox, right? And you might say, why? I mean, doesn't it show that there's no possible world where you get a world with an infinite past that's different from our world? No, it doesn't show that. Branching actualism does not tell us that, right? Because branching actualism is compatible with the view, for instance, it gets us into some questions about the topology of time itself, right? So here's a possibility, right? There's our space-time continuum, right? There's years 1, 2, 3, 4, and years minus 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and that's it, right? That's one possibility. Here's another possibility. There's our time continuum, and there's another space-time continuum that's earlier than it, right? And another one that's earlier than it, right? So you get copies of our space-time continuum in the past and in the future, right? And it could be that our whole space-time continuum branches off the actual world in the earlier space-time continuum somewhere, right? So there was some kind of universe maker back there, right? Who in one of those earlier space-time continua decided, I'm going to affect future continua in a certain way, right? And I'm going to produce a bunch of Grim Reapers in that future space-time continuum, right? It's perfectly possible, right? Unless causal finitism is true, right? If causal finitism is true, then our universe has a beginning, and there are no earlier universes, period, right? Because if there were, you'd get violations of causal finitism. But if you take away causal finitism, now who knows what the structure of time might be? There might be, there might be our past going out all the way infinitely far, and then before that, another space-time continuum, and more, and so on, right? I mean, if your readers know anything about non-standard analysis in mathematics, where you can create models of the real numbers, where you don't have just our real numbers, but you also have infinite number of copies of the real numbers out there, both smaller than and larger than our real numbers, and that's perfectly consistent with analysis, and it gives us lots of interesting results when you look at those non-standard models. So we're basically talking about non-standard models of space-time now. And if we reject causal finitism, those are logically possible, mathematically possible alternatives. And in those alternatives, you could still get a Grim Reaper paradox, right? So basically, what you'd have to add is not just branching actualism, but branching actualism plus, the claim that there's no earlier times beyond our infinite past, right? And so that's, of course, what I'll reject, that second stipulation, right? Unless you believe in causal finitism. Right? So it doesn't. So the point is, as a branching actualist, I'm not forced to I don't lose my argument, actually, right? The objector would have to add another assumption in addition to actualism, and they would have no reason for that further assumption, right? No reason to rule out such super past times, let's say, right?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Now for this next one, I think Joe, he also has another interesting argument. He says like this: suppose God creates something. We can say tablet, we can say paper, whatever, and it reads, I will intend to create X, whether it's an angel or a water bottle, whatever. If and only if I don't intend to create X tomorrow, right? Now, also suppose that you have this patchwork principle, which seemingly will allow you to replicate this individually possible scenario infinitely into the future. And of course, this is meant as a paradox, or you generate the kind of paradox that causal finitism was employed to solve in the first place. So what do you think about this kind of counter?
Yeah, so I haven't read that particular paper yet, but I think the way you describe it can't quite work, right? Because you could have that paper and then just got to do X on every other day, and there'd be no paradox, right? You would do it, you do it today, but not tomorrow, and then not tomorrow, but the day after, and so on. So I think to get the paradox, you'd have to say something like this: I intend to create X if and only if I won't create X at any time in the future. That will create a Grim Reaper-like paradox, right? If now, of course, there's a bunch of ifs and ands and buts here, right? I mean, God could certainly create such pieces of paper and publish them at every day in the future. No contradiction. The papers just sit there, right, saying all these things. We haven't, it's true or not, right, of God. So we have to assume that when he writes, I intend to do such and such, he really means it, right, as God, right? So let's assume that that's what he means, right? So then the pieces of paper are actually irrelevant, right? What really matters is, can God intend, right, to do X if and only if he doesn't do X in the future today? And then tomorrow, can he intend the same thing? And the day after that, can he intend the same thing, and so on, right? Okay, so a number of problems here, right? First of all, this is a very anthropomorphic picture of God. It doesn't actually fit classical theism well at all. It sort of assumes that God is like me or you. He's in time. He's got some kind of giant brain in which intentions are formed today and tomorrow and so on. And so all that's just wrong on my picture. So this is kind of a non-starter. But still, I'll try and play along. Let's say, okay, let's suppose that we could make some kind of sense of this, of God having like intentions at one day and then another intention tomorrow. I'll sort of pretend that that's possible. So here's the deeper problem, I think, right? So if God intends to do X, if and only if he won't do X in the future, right? We then have to assume that God looks into the future and sees whether he's going to do X or not in the future, right? And he sees, oh, I'm not going to do X in the future, so I'll do it today, right? Or he sees, I will do it X in the future, so I won't do it today. So in either case, right, you've got to assume that there's some future fact which is known by God, and then is causing God either to create X or not to create X via his intention, right? So what we're describing is a situation where we've got temporally reversed causation, right? Future event causing a past event, right? And so the scenario that Joe is describing is one in which there's a causal regress that goes into the future instead of into the past, right? A caused by B, B caused by C, C caused by D, where B, C, and D are getting further and further into the future instead of into the past, right? And my response is, okay, that's going to violate causal finitism, right? So that's not possible. So God can't do that, right? And you might say, whoa, God's omnipotent. Yeah, he's omnipotent, but he can't do metaphysically impossible things. You can't arrange a world in which there's an infinite causal regress, because that's just metaphysically impossible if this argument is correct, right? So yeah, he can't arrange a world that works like that. And end of story.
Yeah, that this is question begging, since the very thing in question is whether causal finitism is true. So moreover, they say their parity argument uses the patchwork principle with the assumption of an endless future against either causal finitism or an endless future. So employing causal finitism as a reply won't be successful unless there is some reason to prefer Dr. Koons' use of the patchwork principle for causal finitism and not theirs.
Right. Okay. So I think they're sort of losing track of the dialectical situation here, right? So I've given an argument for causal finitism. Okay. This is not an objection to any of the premises of that argument or the validity of the argument, right? This is an objection that says, if that argument works, this other argument should also work, right? In which case you would have to be committed, I would have to be committed to the uncomfortable conclusion that the future can't be infinite, right? Now, of course, I could embrace that, I guess, right? I could say, okay, fine, maybe the future can't be infinite either, but I don't think that actually follows from the premises, right? So the question is, if the argument is, if causal finitism were true, then the future couldn't be infinite. But I think the future could be infinite, therefore I have to reject causal finitism. That's the way the objection should work, right? So for me to say, no, causal finitism rules out the kind of future you're describing, that's not question begging. That's just defending my position, right? That's showing that my position is logically consistent. So of course I'm assuming causal finitism. I'm showing that if causal finitism is true, it doesn't follow that the future can't be infinite. It could be infinite. It's just that it can't incorporate a causal regress, right? Because that's what causal finitism says, is there aren't any causal regresses. So to talk about question beggingness here is just really out of place. It's not appropriate at this point in the dialectic. Now, the second point, I think, is, again, a little bit unclear here. So let's see. Like I said, I mean, the patchwork principle is about events in time, right? So as I said, God could create all these pieces of paper with words on them, exactly the way Joe describes them. They'd all be false, right? So what? there's no contradiction there, right? It only becomes a contradiction when you say, oh, no, God means the things on those pieces of paper. He intends to make them true, right? But in order to intend to make them true, he's got to set up a world in which causal finitism is violated, but that's impossible. So therefore, he can't intend them to be true, right? So the individual patches aren't intrinsic, right? and therefore the patchwork principle just doesn't apply at all, right? Because it depends. It's sort of obviously, right? The possibility, could God intend to create X if and only if he doesn't create X in the future, right? Could God intend that? Who knows, right? It depends on what's going on in the future, right? So it's not obviously possible in the same way the Grim Reaper is possible.
So for the last question, you might think that there is an infinite number of future events, and these infinite number of future events are such that they are causally prior to God's knowledge of them, and so prima facie at least, causal finitism entails the impossibility of an endless future and divine foreknowledge. So that conjunction there. Now, interestingly, Alexander Pruss covers this objection in Infinity Causation and Paradox from pages 186 to 188. He concludes that God's knowledge is explained by these future events, but not caused by them. So it's a different type of relationship. And he proposes a model which he describes as a theological analog to the Cartesian model of perception. And he notes that this isn't ad hoc because there is reason in classical theism to select a model like this one. And so you might even say something similar to God's seemingly infinite reasons for creating. Do you share Pruss's reply here, or do you prefer another style of response?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting response. I'm not sure that I wouldn't reject it, but I would go a different way, I think. I would go a bit more radical, actually, than Pruss. So on my picture of divine, well, maybe this isn't so radical, but on my view of classical theism, God is not affected by creation at all. So there's nothing in the created world affects God. The causation is sort of always the other direction. And so his foreknowledge is a kind of foreordaining by God rather than a passive receiving information about the future. Now then you might say, okay, what about free will and the problem of evil? And okay, well, I've got to say a lot about that because I don't believe in a certain kind of radical sort of libertarianism that some theists do. I still believe in free will, of course, as Thomas does. But I would give a different story here. I actually have a paper in Philosophica Christi years ago called Dual Agency, where I kind of lay out this view that the idea is that God's knowing a future event, including a future action of mine, and my future action are actually the same fact, just looked at in different ways. One from a divine perspective, one from the perspective. So just as I'm free to do whatever I do, and God is also free in knowing what I do, but those aren't two different events that are somehow causally or even explanatorily related to each other. They're just the same fact looked at in two different perspectives. So I don't think there's any worries here on my picture about divine foreknowledge, violating causal finitism or any kind of finitism for that matter.
Yeah, that's an interesting, very helpful response. Well, before we wrap up, we did want to ask you one final question. What is a woman?
Yeah, right. So I've looked into this some. I've got a friend, Thomas Bogardus, who's written quite a bit about this. So again, from an Aristotelian point of view, certainly every mammalian organism is permanently disposed teleologically to participate in reproduction a male way or a female way, right from the moment of conception, right? And I think that's true 100%. There are no exceptions, I think, to that. Various intersex people are people where that teleological orientation is somehow frustrated in some way or other, maybe by something that happens in the womb, or maybe by some kind of genetic failure to express a certain gene or something like that. But in 100% of the cases of a mammalian organism, it is from conception oriented by its nature to be either male or female. And so a woman is just a human female in that sense. right? And so I think it's perfectly binary. Every human being is either a man or a woman, and you can that womanhood might not express itself as fully in some cases as it does in others, but they remain in fact a woman. Now, whether legally and socially we should treat all women as women, or should treat some of them as men, or whatever, is another very complicated question. But metaphysically speaking, I think that's the answer.
Yeah. So as while we're on this miscellaneous kind of topics, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Koons, are you pro-life? And if you are, would you run some like a very similar argument for pro-life the way that you just did for the trans women are not women, as some sort of a teleological disposition or goal directedness within the zygote? And that's sort of the essence or the sort of essential properties that we have.
Right. Yeah. So the question is, when did I begin to exist? Right. Aristotle didn't know all the details we know about embryology, right? So he thought that I began to exist several weeks after conception, when the material of the sperm had finished its job of working the menstrual material into a human form. But we know now that actually that process is done as soon as the sperm and the egg, combine. You immediately got a new organism, which has its own autonomous form, which is going to develop. And so that was me already, right? So if I have certain rights as a human being, I had those same rights as a zygote, right? As a moment after fertilization. So I think that I do take a pretty staunchly pro-life position. I would put it not just in terms of the right to life, right, but just in terms of the wrongness of taking a life, right, and especially of an human life with its whole future before it. I think it's really that's profoundly wrong, intrinsically evil to do that.
So I guess this concludes our time here. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for the people who are joining, and thank you very much, Dr. Robert C. Koons.
Great, my pleasure. Thanks very much for the invitation.